Okay, we're gonna jump into it in a sec here. How was your guys' weekend? How did you had a lot of things over this weekend. You had the test, you finished up your last week's project with Tiny App. How did those things go? So. So today we're going to be focusing on CSS, and specifically we're going to be looking at the box model a bit. This GIF meme thing's kind of accurate with CSS. This week with your Tweeter project, you're going to be focusing on the styling a bit more than last week, and you'll find CSS, I know some of you might have had some experience with it in the past, but it's kind of fidgety. It's kind of, you kind of poke things, you try something, sends everything this way, you try it again, and you're just going to need to play with it until you get something that looks right. And we're going to be looking at briefly what semantic HTML is. Of course, we're going to be looking at cascading style sheets, CSS. We're going to be looking at a thing called reset, or its alternative, normalize. We're going to look at the box model with CSS. We're going to look at some block level elements and inline elements. We're going to look at floats, and we're going to look at kind of modern CSS. So kind of the thread of today's lecture is, we're focusing on this box model, and we're kind of seeing the history of why that box model existed, and understanding where CSS has been to kind of make way for the newer, more modern ways that people use CSS. So everything we learned today is kind of fundamental to understanding CSS, but is not necessarily the most recent or fancy tools that you'll be using with CSS. But just before we dive into kind of the content of today's lecture, just a few things about boot camp at this stage. So we're back at it. We're week 3. We just had our first project submission. We're going to be getting more and more concepts this week, just like with every week. And this week and the following weeks, you're going to find that the course is going to be less kind of direct in its guidance, in the reading materials, in the directions for your projects. As the weeks go on, it's going to kind of hold your hand a little bit less, leave room for you to explore and find materials on your own. And that's not to say, the whole mentors and lecturers aren't there to support you, but the goal is to kind of build your skills at finding resources and looking at documents and kind of, problem solving on your own to a degree, because there's not always going to be this course content to lead you step by step. So the more you can build those tools of looking and finding resources, the better. Bottom here just says that kind of also applies to lectures to a degree. The lectures are going to be, going through material that's a bit more complex. There might be some things that you don't understand right away. That gives you the chance to kind of look it up on yourself, and then if it's still something that's not clear, come of course with the questions. And I think this more applies to kind of fringe things in the lecture. So today we're talking about CSS and the box model. If you have questions directly about those things, of course ask them in lecture. Of course, I'll try to be as clear as I can so that those questions don't become a lot. But if it's something kind of on the sidelines, that might be a chance to kind of look it up and research for yourself. The other thing to think about is we just finished our Tiny App project and we submitted it. And some of us might have gotten some rejections back in our project. That's nothing to worry about. That's going to happen for all the projects, and it's not a big deal. It's not like, oh, you failed this project or something. The whole point of the submission and evaluation process is to get feedback on your code so you can learn from it and see what improvements you can make. So this is going to happen in Lighthouse Labs. This also will happen probably eventually in your future jobs. When you're coding and you have that request pull cycle where someone's evaluating their code, they're going to give you feedback. They're going to tell you things that you're going to need to improve. It's a natural stage in the life cycle of your code, and it's something not necessarily to be like fearful of, but to be like, you know, curious about what you can improve in your code and how you can make it better going forward. So those rejection things are just like notes that you can look at and improve your code and you know, move forward with it. The other tool like useful for that type of thing is when you're wondering like, you know, what do I need to meet for these requirements of these projects? If you go up in your program and you go down to projects and you click on one of these guys, you guys have probably seen this, but you have this project description, general overview of the project, but it gives you also the behavior requirements. So before submitting your project, you can go through this list and see, okay, did I hit all of these things for my index get? What about for my get at /URLs? You can go down the list and kind of just give your project a run through. There's also some hints in here sometimes, like for example, these like post ones, that's something you might need to test with curl. That's something you might need to test with Postman. But this page is designed so that you can, to the best of your knowledge before you're submitting your project, hit those requirements. But again, the whole purpose of someone evaluating it is so you can take notes and improve on it, and it's a good process, not something to feel discouraged about. There might just be something you missed that the evaluator was able to see. So this week, like I said, you're going to be working on a project called Tweeter, and this project's going to be a little more front end involved. You're going to be, you know, styling it a bit more heavier than you did with Tiny App, and you're going to jump into the HTML and then CSS nitty gritty of it. I thought I'd just demo kind of like a running version of Tweeter for you guys to see. So here we have the home page. This composed tweet box is like toggleable. If I type in stuff here, I see the amount of characters that I have left. If I hit tweet, you know, I get this new tweet that was posted. When I'm hovering over this tweet, I can see there's some hover effects showing these icons at the bottom, text is being bolder, different things like that. There's also some input validation. If I try and hit tweet with no content, I get an error. If I also, I could probably copy paste some text and this would be faster, but if I go over the character limit, I'm also going to see an error. So this is kind of like maybe the basic styling I could do for Tweeter. Some people decide to, you know, throw a little spin on maybe the font, on the colors, but this is kind of the basic of what it's going to look like. Can add more. Let's see what else. Yeah. So another thing to note, as I'm scrolling, we can see this top menu. You know, it stays fixed to the top of that. That's something we might address today a little bit. But not super complex style, but the thing I'm trying to convey is that you'll be responsible for the style this time. The material will guide you on the specific steps that you're going to take, but it's not all going to be there for you in the project file. Cool. So what are we focusing on in this lecture? We're looking at CSS in the box model, kind of a history of how CSS has grown. The box model itself has many confusing parts and many hacks that people have used to kind of get around and make their styling better. You'll encounter some of those this week. For this reason, you'll need to kind of poke things until they work. We're going to be focusing on kind of this like vanilla CSS, so we build a good foundation. We have to understand this older box model before we look at some of the newer things that might be out there. So we're not focusing on today things like CSS frameworks, Bootstrap being a very popular one that some of you probably have used. That's going to come later. Also things like Sass or SCSS. It's a better way to write CSS, and there are other alternatives to Sass, but it's it makes writing CSS a bit faster. We're going to look at that. It says week 4, but I think we're going to be touching on it at the end of this week. So not something you need to worry about just yet. And we're also not going to be focusing on HTML, although we are going to do a quick look at semantic HTML just to cover it. So semantic HTML is just the idea that your HTML should be expressive in the content that it's holding. Your tags can have names that kind of describe the purpose of the content that they're holding. I'll show you my actual notes here. I said, for example, using strong tag instead of bold, and I just used the tag. So I should have given these some little string quotes. So strong is more descriptive than just the letter B. When I surround content in the word strong, or the strong tag, it's kind of obvious that the wording will be stronger, will be bolded. So if we look at this example here, this crudely laid out website, what do you guys think the purpose of this layout is? What is the layout of my website? What are the things that I'm trying to show here? Yeah, so I might want to treat each div in a different way. But in general, it's hard to understand like what I'm trying to do. A more expressive way of doing this maybe is this markdown. So I'm using, instead of a div tag, I'm using a header tag. Instead of, all my div tags are actually being replaced. I'm using this article tag, and then inside of it, I have a figure tag, and then finally I have a footer tag. So just looking at this without any like knowledge of anything else going on in my site, I have a lot clearer idea of what's happening. I kind of know what a header is. I know what an article is in terms of human relatable concepts. I know what a figure should be, and I know what a footer should be. There are kind of many semantic HTML tags, and you can search them up to see which ones you can use. We have a bunch like article, aside, details, fig caption, figure, footer, header, main, mark, nav, section, summary, time. So if you find those being applicable to the content that you're using, it's preferable to use them as opposed to a generic div tag. And as we'll see a bit later, it actually helps us in our styling as well, because if I'm using a header tag, I can kind of target that header tag to give particular style to it, instead of maybe creating a class and adding that class onto a div tag called header. And I'm able to be more minimal with the classes that I'm using. But we'll get into that a bit more. For the most part, a lot of these new HTML5 semantic elements, they function very similar to divs. So we're going to look at the difference between block and inline. But all of these guys are going to perform kind of like a block element. And their main purpose, again, is to divide up our content. Cool. And the other thing before we kind of get into the con is the tools that we're going to be using. The biggest one that is the most helpful and why we should probably be using Chrome for our testing and viewing our web applications going forward is developer tools. So with Chrome, if I look at this site here, I can just right-click on the page. I can hit inspect. I can also hit the little menu guy up here and go down to, where is it? Oh, maybe because I have it open. More tools, and I can go developer tools. This developer tools, like little side window, is going to be extremely helpful with CSS and styling. You might have used it at this point for like the console to see any JavaScript that's being printed out. But if I go to the elements, I get two very useful windows. One that just shows the HTML breakdown, and the other that shows the styles that are being applied to those HTML elements. The other like really useful kind of button in this layout is this very top left one. It's got this little, kind of square with an arrow to it. if I select that button, let's get this window a bit bigger first. So if I select this button, it kind of lets me highlight any element in this page. So you can see it's highlighting on the page. And then if I want to look at this header, I can see this little pop-up window. It gives me some information, the color of the font, margin. If I click on it, it will bring it up in the HTML window, and it'll also bring up all the styles in the style window. And this style window is going to be kind of our saving grace. For this H2 that I've clicked on, I can scroll through and see all the styles that are being applied to it from any source throughout my document. I see that from the style selectors here, H1, H2, H3, that's from this source, it's getting the font family, these guys, Segoe, and then Arial. It's getting a font weight, it's getting a margin. From H2, it's getting its font size. This star, which is everything when we're using in CSS, it's getting something called box sizing inherent. And we can just kind of scroll down the list. We can also, unselect styles that are being applied to it. So if I'm testing, I can toggle this on and off, and I can see in the content that it is changing all of my headers because that style is no longer applied, and now it is applied. I can also see certain styles have been crossed out. So when I select a particular element, if this style is crossed out, it means it's being overwritten by another style somewhere else. So its font size is not 1.5 EM because further up on my style sheet, its font size is 30 pixels. You obviously can't have two font sizes for a font, so one needs to be chosen. This style window will show all of the styles that are trying to be applied. The styles that aren't crossed out are the ones that successfully were applied, and the ones that are crossed out are the ones that were kind of like overridden by another style. We'll be looking at how CSS decides which style to favor over another one in this kind of battle of styles. But Chrome Development Tools allows us to see that really easily. The other thing that we can do is you can add new styles as you want. So here I'm saying, well, maybe I want a margin top on all of my headers. I want that to be like 200 pixels. I'm trying a new ridiculous style for my page, and now we get this like much more spaced out content on my left here. I highly encourage doing this as you're fiddling with little CSS things. It's much faster to click on this developer tools, add a new style. I want my font's color to be blue now. All my headers are blue. My Control S is out of habit. So all the fonts are blue. Again, faster than going back into my text editor, finding my CSS page, finding the specific thing I want to edit, changing it. You can do quick little edits here, see if you like the change, and if it's working properly, head back over to your text editor and add the change there. Again, you can toggle your new changes, all these different things to kind of see what your new changes will look like, very fast and responsive. It's also good at isolating like problems in your CSS code. So if I come to my page and I'm like, hey, why is this blue? In my CSS, I just said that it should be black. It's not doing what I want. So if I click on this little arrow button again and I go to my header, I click on it, I can scroll through here and find out where it's getting that color. And I go, oh, it's getting it from the H1 tag. That must be somewhere else in my CSS. I should go and find that. So we'll be using this throughout kind of the examples that we're looking at today. But yeah, highly encourage you to make the most of developer tools for your front-end development. So CSS, that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now, style sheets is maybe a bit straightforward. We have these documents that we're applying style to our content. But the cascading may be a little less straightforward. Cascading means that our CSS is going to act like a tiered waterfall. Styles cascade or flow downwards from one source to another, adding to the styles below them. So here we saw that there's all these different sources of style. This tag, this thing, this, all of these. And they're all working together to style these one element. They're all cascading, building on each other to give a complete style that we see in the page. And there's a special cascading algorithm that determines how to find the value or style to apply for each property of each element. So we're going to look at a little example. Just going to go to my code folder, and I have, oh, not day 5. So I have a CSS file here that I set up called waterfall. And I also have a cascade.html. So the HTML page is pretty basic. I have a header, and I have 2 things that I'm linking in my header. One is just some fonts, and the other is this waterfall style sheet. So one way to include a style sheet is to link it in the header, giving it the path in my directory where it should be found. And then I just have a couple boxes. So we're going to look at this in the browser to get a better idea of what we're looking at. First, I have to find it looks like in my directory. And we're week 3, day 1, lecture, code, and we wanted to look at Cascade 1. So the purpose of this is just to see how styles cascade on each other, or how styles build on each other. So this is just 1, 2, 3, 4 divs inside of one another. If we look at the HTML, we can see outer div, inner div 2, inner div 3, and then finally the 4th div. And this text is kind of to illustrate what sources each of these divs are getting their styles from. So in the outermost div, we have this original text color, just this blue kind of like navy color. And it's explicitly defined for this div. So if I look at the styles for this outer div, I see that the color is slate blue, color being the font color. So that's this guy's source. And then if I go into the second div, it looks like it has, it actually doesn't look like it has the same font color, but it does. The background is just kind of throwing it off a bit. So we see that it has slate blue. But these both are getting their color from different ways. So this is getting the color from an actual style thing, and this one is getting its color from inheritance. There are certain properties in CSS that the elements can get from their parents. So text color, things to do with text usually are the main source of this. But text color in particular, we can get from a parent. So because this outermost div has blue, the innermost div should have blue too. And so should all children inside of that div. But in the next layer and the layer after that, we see both of these colors are different. So we have to investigate where they're getting their styles from. So if I click on this third div then, we see that it has a inner kind of style being applied to it for its class inner, where it's getting the color snow. And then on the innermost one, it's got this coral color, and we see that it has this element.style where it's getting a color coral. So the point of this is to show the different ways an element can get style and their importance. So this secondmost div is getting its color from inheritance, meaning it doesn't have any style applied to it, but its parent does, so that's where it's going to get its style. This div here has its style set from inheritance, but it also has its style set from an external style sheet. if I look at the style in waterfall.css and I look at inner, this style sheet is setting the color to snow. So we have two styles here that are coming from different location. It has an inherent style that could be applied, or it has a style that's supplied from an embedded or external style sheet. So we can see that the white is winning out. It's choosing the white over the inherited one. And then again, we go one deeper and we see this guy has a coral, and this guy has all of these same styles being applied as each outer layer. So it has the possible inherited blue style. It also has the inner style. So if I click on it, it also has the inner style we can see here, wanting to apply a snow color to it. But then it finally has an inline style, giving it a color coral. So the inline is ruling out. So we can see inline applies over everything else. An external style sheet will apply over an inherited color, and with nothing else, an inherited color will show itself. If we look, the last one, that coral doesn't appear anywhere in my style sheet, and that's because when it's inline, it means right in the HTML, right in that tag is where the color is defined. So this cascading thing means we can have multiple sources of style, all like building to make a coherent element. Although this innermost element, this guy here, has an inline style that's overriding the color, I can still go to the inner tag, and I can give it like a font style of italic. And even though it's overwriting the color from that tag, it can still get the italic from that tag. So we don't have a case where we have like one specific style description that is only used. We have all of these different sources coming together. Some of them are more important than others, meaning that the style will be chosen over another source, but they still get added together. So this inner thing, CSS was smart enough to pick and choose. It said, OK, I will use the italic from it. I will use the font weight from it, but I won't use the color because I have a more important color here. That's kind of the cascading effect of CSS. Any questions on kind of this guy and how we're getting the different layers of styles applied to it? Cool. All of this code will be in the notes, so you can play with it after if you want to see a little more. So from that example, we saw kind of the three main ways that we can apply styles. Well, mostly we saw the last two, but you can embed styles. So if I go directly into the HTML file itself, in the head or other places, I can do an opening style. I can do this tag and a closing style tag, and this will be applied to my document. So if I wanted to change the font weight to something else, I can do it right in my HTML document. The other one that's similar to this is external style sheets. So I can also put a link to a separate file that has a bunch of style in it. Whether I do it this way or whether I link it externally, there's kind of no difference in the preference aside from order. So the order in which I'm including these kind of matters. This style sheet, because I've included in the head, line 5, will be loaded and applied to my stuff before this style sheet, 7, which was applied lower down in my file. But to the document, to the page itself, it doesn't care if I do it with style tag or if I actually do it with a link to an external one. This is the same as if I had copied all of the style from in that document and just placed it on this line 5 in like a really big, messy way. Of course, the obvious benefit being when I link an external style sheet, I can declutter my code and include it somewhere else. In general, you're not going to be using this. Anytime you find yourself using these style tags, it's probably better to just put it in an external style sheet. But it is a way that you can include style nonetheless. So those are the two, embedded and external. And the last one we saw was an inline style. So right within the line of the tag, in this case a div tag, we can use this keyword style and we can set any kind of key value pairs. So in our example, we set the color to coral. This one will be kind of the highest preference. If we have a color in our inline, a color in our inner, and a color in our embedded, it's going to choose the inline style every time. But again, these all work in coherence with each other. They build on other things. If there's not competing styles, they'll just be all applied to the element that they're being targeted to. Just a quick note on syntax for these guys. We have this thing up here. We have opening and closing brackets. And then we have a list of what kind of looks like key value pairs from JavaScript objects. And what we call them are selector lists. So the things that we're choosing to apply style to are selector lists. And then we have the property on the left and the value on the right. So here my selector list is just, I'm looking at the class box. And I'm setting properties like minimum height, minimum width, padding. And I'm giving them values like 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 100 pixels. The next thing we're going to look at is resets or normalizes, or normalize, I guess, as it's one thing. So if I look back to this kind of WeSchools page, and we look at the styles that are being applied to anything really, if I go far enough down, let's pick something else. I can see a particular style, and I see something called user agent style sheet. Whereas the other styles, I'm seeing CSS files. This is a file called W3 CSS. Actually, they're all kind of from that. But somewhere in the styling, I'm going to see something called user agent style sheet. And this is applying so that when I go over this link, it gives me a cursor pointer. So the user agent style sheet is the default styling that the browser applies to any page that I load in it. So that's things like if you've seen like a really bland website and you see those purple links, purple is purple with the underline. That's usually user agent style sheet. By default, like my headers, H1, are a bit bigger, a bit bolder. That's probably the user agent style sheet. Here we're seeing the default for, like, again, a link is to have this little, my pointer go from a nice arrow to this like finger guy. That's the user agent style sheet. So previously, this in the history of CSS was more of a problem. Kind of the different browsers were more opinionated on what the basic styles of a page should look like. So the user agent style sheets for Chrome versus Mozilla versus like whenever people used Internet Explorer were like kind of more different. And the problem was that with this was if you just applied some kind of top-level style over a page, your stuff would look different depending on which browser you went to. So if I open this in Chrome, it might look like this. If I opened it in Mozilla, like, you know, it might end up looking different. Today, that's a little less of a thing. The user agent style sheets for each browser are like less opinionated, but there still are some differences in the base style that they give each page. And that was the reason for a thing called a reset. Especially back when it was more of a thing, a reset would remove any default browser styling, often called user agent style sheet, The goal is to remove any browser inconsistencies. So before I load any of my style, I just apply a clean reset to everything. Then I know any style that I apply on top of that is going to look the same throughout all of my browsers. So the famous reset is this guy's, this like Meyer guy, and it looks like this. You can go to this page. You can, just copy this CSS here, put it in your own reset file, load it at the beginning of your page, and it'll make everything consistent for all of your browsers. You can see things like pretty much every tag, and then we're just making the margin, padding, borders all 0. We're giving it a font size of 100%. We're making sure its font is inherited from the parent, and it does a bunch of other things. The thing with this reset is it's not necessarily resetting all of the tags to something useful. It's resetting them to like base nothing. Like our headers now are just going to look like our paragraphs. Our H5s are going to look like our H2s. Everything's just going to be generic and the same. And in the way that we're building our styles, we're going to have to like apply meaning to it. I'm going to have to go in and give H1 a bigger size than H2, than H3, H4, all of those things. So useful, but kind of requires a lot of work on our end to like build up the styles off of nothing. The alternative is a normalize. So resets impose a homogeneous visual style by flattening the default styles for almost all elements. So everything's going to look the same. In contrast, normalize retains many useful default browser styles, meaning you don't have to redeclare styles for all of the common like H1, H5, A tags, but it's going to make them consistent across all the browsers. So it keeps kind of the styling of the H1 being bigger, my biggest header bigger than my second biggest header. It keeps things that make sense, but it's still going to let me make sure that there's consistency across all of my browsers. I've included a link for that. You can read up on it. There's also a node package that you can download for normalize, so it makes it kind of easy in that respect. It also, normalize has like a couple additional things beyond styling that it kind of helps with. It can correct some common browser bugs with styling and tags. So a little bit more comprehensive than just the reset. But again, both of these still somewhat useful, but way less useful than they were in the past, because browsers are deciding to kind of play nicer with each other and keep a somewhat consistent user experience across them. Okay, now to get into the real meat of today's thing, we're looking at the box model. So within HTML, the idea of this box model is that every element is a box. So if I go into, say, this guy that we were looking at before, and remember we said we can add new styles. So I want to set border. I want to set it to 4 pixels, solid red. I can see, and this is applied to everything, this star selector, that means any element in my page. I see that everything in this page has now this like square box around it. This kind of illustrates anything I put in HTML is a box. And kind of one of the outer layers of a box is the border, and we're seeing the border here across this whole page. So this header, this div here, for some reason HTML and semantic elements are separate. Everything we have is going to have this box around it, and that's part of the border model or border box model. The other thing we can see. When I scroll over things with this selector thing, we can see these like different colors. And this is also breaking down the box model of each of these elements. This orange color, that's the margin of my box. Margin is like the space around the box itself. Can push elements away. It adds this nice spacing on the top. It's kind of like a darker orange, but we can also see it because we've turned it red, is the border. The border is the official start to the box. It's the border between the box's content and the margin. And then the blue is the content itself. The other one that this guy doesn't have right here is padding, and these guys both have padding. The green is our padding, and that is between the border and our content, and it can push anything inside of our box further in to give some like spacing. The border box model, the whole point is to give us spacing and layout with each of our elements. With this header here, I can position it further down because of margin. These little yeses are kind of in the center and space nice because of padding. I want to push them inside something. Right now, pretty uselessly though, we have this red box around everything because of the border. You can see kind of the breakdown here. We go margin, border, padding, and then interior with the blue, we have our content. So all elements have all of these different properties, and you can set them in CSS. You already saw me setting some of them. I had like padding here. I did margin inside of the We Schools page. You can set all of them to get those like layouts in your page. So if you want more spacing around the boxes, give it margin. If you want more spacing inside the boxes, give it your padding. This is a useful guide for just playing with stuff. So I can change my different properties, the width and height of a thing. I can give it different padding. So if I throw my padding on the top high, you can see this space here changes. If I go on the right, space on the right changes. Same for the other things. I can give it a big margin on the top. I can give it a big border on the top. I can change all of these things. There's one kind of tricky thing with this border box model, and that is, how do we know how big the box is? So it says here, but I'm going to hide that. And can I? So I'm going to sync all of the padding, margin, and border. So left, right, top, bottom are all the same. I'm going to give it some random values. And I want you guys to tell me what is the size of this box. So these are the numbers that we have to work with here. We have a width, 225. I have a margin, 40. Padding, 20. And a border width of 15. What is the width of my box? These numbers aren't the easiest to add up, but let's see if we can get it. Or maybe someone can just walk me through like what numbers you would add. You don't need to give me like a specific number. So to get this width, what would we be doing? Double the margin, double the padding. Except for the first one. So that's true except for the margin. So the margin is kind of considered outside of the box. It's the space around the box. So the actual width of my thing would be double the padding, or double the border, double the padding for each side, and then the content. I guess I should have been more specific in what I was saying. But the size in general is considered the box, so being up to the border, and then the margin is like everything outside of that. So yeah, exactly. But the problem with this is it's my content plus my padding plus my border. If I have a bunch of boxes on my, so if I have a bunch of boxes, like I have that box, oh geez, I have another box here and another box here, and I want them all to be the same like size, but maybe in this one I want the content to be like really small in the center like this. Maybe in this one I want the content to be like okay. So I have this one, I have this one. Maybe in the second one I want the content to like stretch all the way out almost to the edge, and then maybe in this one I want it really small in the center. So I want different paddings essentially. The space from my content, so this inner box to the border, or this inner box to the border, is my padding. If I want them all to be the same kind of like outer size, but I'm changing the inner padding, now I need to do a bunch of calculations. I need to say, okay, the content for this one is 100, plus my padding's different, plus my border. I need to change my content size in order to be, so let's see, our width was, here our width is 295 pixels. I can't just set the width of this box to 295 pixels. I have to go 295 minus my padding, minus my border, both of those times 2, get that number, and set the width for this one to that. For this one, I need to do a different set of calculations. I need to go content. This one's like much smaller, maybe it's 50. That minus my total width I want, 295, minus my border and my padding, so I can get this size. I need to change it based on the padding for each one. So that's like super annoying, but there's a thing to get around this that's almost universally used at this point, and that's called border box. So the default box sizing for our elements is content box, and that's the one we're looking at here, where the total size of our box is the content plus the padding plus the border size. But if I go border box, well, first actually let's illustrate this a bit. So here's my thing here. If I'm adding a lot of padding, my width goes up a bunch, 455. So if one element I have the same width, I want to add more padding, my total width is 455. If I want another element with less padding, my total width is now 315. So just changing my padding is like drastically changing the size of my box. Whereas if I use border box, the width is the absolute width from edge of the border here to edge of the border here. Border box, it's much easier to get this situation where I have 3 equal boxes with different padding and things like that. So my width right now is 225, and my generated dimensions width is 225. So my width is exactly from border to border how it's going to be. If I increase it to, let's see, now it's 435, it's still 435. And if I change the padding, it's still 435. I can give like almost no padding. It's still 435. So now I can set as many equal size boxes as I want. I can play with their padding. I can play with their borders, change them. And the width of that element is going to stay the same. It's going to stay 435. So it gives me more power to have a bunch of like equal looking things without having to crunch the numbers and say, oh, or like the other scenario is maybe I have 3 boxes and they all have the same padding and border, and I want them to have the same padding and border. But then down the line I say, oh, all of these should have a little less padding because the content looks too spaced out. Like this is too far into the middle. I go back and with content box, I change, so we had a bunch of padding, for example. I change it down a little bit. Now all my boxes are smaller. The layout of my site is going to shift around and change. Whereas if I'm using border box, I can say, okay, we have this like padding on all of my elements. I want to reduce it down a little bit. I bring it down. My boxes are still going to behave the same next to each other. They're going to have the same margin. My layout is kind of going to be conserved across everything. So the takeaway with box sizing is that we want to use border box. What we can do essentially is just use the all grabber in our style sheet, and we can go box sizing, and we want to set it to border box. This should be like this, and this non-default thing, that's not actually part of the tag. That's just like a comment I was making. So this is what we should be using. It'll save us a lot of headaches. Everything, let's use border box. But just to review, our content box is the height. This isn't divided by height or width is the content size, and then the padding and border additionally add to the size of the box. You can't set the total box size with one number. You have to do it with a combination of those three. Whereas border box, the height or width is the content size plus the padding plus the border. So padding and border are accounted for in this number, and we can set the total size of the box with just a single number in the X or Y direction, depending on what we want to do. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 10:05, and we'll look at block versus inline. All right, let's get at it. So we're going to quickly look at block versus inline. So all HTML elements in HTML by default are either block or inline. So whether you set it or not, they're going to have one of these. And so block level elements, they start on a new line. They take up as much width as they can by default. So they're going to be, if you don't specify how big they are, they're going to be 100% of your screen. They're structural in nature. So most of the block elements are for like setting up, the structure or the layout of your page. And by default, here are some tags that are blocks. So your div tag, the one you're probably going to use more than any other ones, that's a block element. H1 through H6, those are block elements. Your paragraph tag, UL, which is like your list tag, nav, or your list container, I guess. Nav, those are all block level elements. The opposing to block is inline. So inline doesn't start on a new line. It's inline. It doesn't affect elements around it. These are some horrible spelling mistakes in here, but so that means that we can't set the width or height of an inline element. It doesn't really do anything to stuff that's there. It's just the content inline. It's content related. So span, link tags, input, button, image, these are all things. These are all like content related things. We can look at anything here, and we can see, click on this guy, get rid of the console. Yeah, we can see here it's display block. So everything's going to have that. I also have a little thing we can look at here. So this is some text, it's inline. This is a rock, it's block. So if we click on this, this block element here, its default is to take up the whole space left to right. I've set a width and a height on it. Looks like the width and height is around, or it says 200 by 200 pixels, but it's still going to take up the whole line because it's a block element. If we go into that guy and we copy and paste these a couple times, so I can have maybe a couple inline things to see how they behave. I can surround this. I'm going to put this div on one line just to make it clearer. I can surround this div with some inline stuff. Maybe I'll copy this div. We get a couple next to each other. And one more inline guy. So our inline stuff, it's stacking. This is some text or some inline text, and the next one starts right away, inline. This is some inline text. This is some inline text. Our block, stands out in contrast to this inline stuff because it's taking up its own space, its own full width thing. Again, 2 or 3 inline guys, and then a block. And then if we have a couple of block elements next to each other, they're all going to be on their own line. They're all going to be selfish and taking up space. And if I go in here and I try and, these spans, they're inline. If I access the span with my style selector and I try and give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels, save it, we go back here and we refresh, it doesn't look any different. My inline stuff can't have height and width. It won't really affect the other things around it. It's just going to take up the space that it can, usually the text space. And we can see as I grow and shrink the thing, it is somewhat responsive. It's just going to take up the lines that it can. Whereas if I make my My block one's really big. They're gonna stay the same size. Now I get this little scroll thing that I need to. So somewhat basic maybe, but all of our elements by default are going to have a block or inline property. And we saw, actually we didn't see, we see that this blocker inline is a part of the property display. So if I want to reset something, if I want to make these spans to be block, I can change that in the CSS. I can say my span now is going to display block. Refresh that. We get some very interesting stuff happening. Now I set each of these spans to 100 and 100, so all our text is overflowing, but they're taking up full space over the line. Yeah, so everything is going to be block or inline, but though by default they'll be one of the two. That's not the only display property that there is. So we have display block, display inline. There's an extra one that we can use that we'll look at in a sec. The one thing to remember with block and inline elements is you don't want to put block elements inside inline elements. And this kind of, from a conceptual point, makes sense. If we're having some text that's inline and we're trying to put block inside of it, the two concepts are like competing with each other now. You can't have something inline and then also be block at the same time. Like if I were to, let's get rid of this block thing. So in this chunk of text, if I put a block thing in here, is it going to then like make part of this inline thing take up its own row? That's kind of against the whole purpose of having the outer thing be inline. So we say we're not going to do that. You're not going to put block elements inside inline elements. So our A tag is an inline element, div tag is a block element. Don't do that. This can even cause like the two things not to render, because your browser is just going to say that's a block inside inline. I don't know what to do there. I don't know whether to show it block or to show the inside thing inline. So I'm just not going to show anything. It's also a violation of HTML standards. So you're like, if you're just making content as you would normally, like what makes sense, you're not necessarily going to be running into putting block stuff inside inline, because it's not a pattern that like is natural to user design, but it's something you should think about that you don't want to do. But of course, do put inline stuff inside of block elements. If I have a div tag, I can put as many links as I want inside there. The whole outer container block thing is going to take up full width and take up space, and then stuff inside can just be inline within that block thing. Like you said, block and inline are display properties that you can set with CSS. So here I can throw, this isn't going to look good, but I can throw a bunch of these inline stuff inside my one rock. So here we go. I have the block, which is the blue right now, and then I have these inline things that are inside of the thing. I mean, maybe this would make sense if I want to have some like text over like a more subtle background, but of course you can put inline stuff inside of a block. The other display property is inline block, which is a combination of the two of them. It is a useful one. We'll look at it in a second, but nothing by default is going to have an inline block display property. They're all going to be block or inline, and then we can kind of add our own inline blocks as we see fit. The next thing we're going to look at is floats. So floats comes from the motivation of this kind of web, or not web, this magazine layout or newspaper layout. So early on in websites, we had kind of like, well, the web should be like these magazines, should be like these newspapers that we have all the time. We have content that we want to show to other people. A similar medium that we use already is the newspaper and magazines. So a lot of websites kind of emulated this style of content. And as you see here, you have like big blocks of text, and then you have images that are displayed, and the text kind of like wraps around these images here like really intensely, and a lot of columns and things like that. So floats were made with this magazine layout in mind, not necessarily the more modern kind of web layouts that we see. So keep that in mind as we go forward. It is a property within CSS that we can set. So here we see float, and you can set it kind of left or right, and we're going to look at what that will do. So again, I've set up a little shell of a page called boat. Boat has a bunch of divs. I'll get this CSS up, and a CSS called float. So boat has a bunch of divs called boat, some of them floating left, some of them floating right, and then we'll talk about this in a second. My CSS for this guy has left. So they're going to float left, right. They're going to float right. And the boat itself just is a little block element with 200 by 200 pixels and a background image. And then I just have some like stuff to kind of present it better to you, like the background color. So here we go. Float allows inline items to wrap around them. They do not take up vertical space in a div, so they float atop block elements. So if I'm resizing this, we can see that my text is going to like flow around my floated elements. And this is exactly that kind of magazine layout that we looked at. So here we have our text flowing around images. That's what we're trying to do with float. So I have these images. There's a bunch of them in a row. Then I have this text thing that's like flowing around it. Based on how I like resize it, it's responsive and will fill up the space that it can. I can also float elements left and right, and the text will wrap around both. So as there's space, it's going to go in there. The one thing I want to look at is it says here that they do not take up vertical space. What this is trying to say is that they don't affect the content layout for like surrounding and containing elements. So if we look here, the parent div, I'll open up DevTools a bit bigger. The parent div for everything here, from this line to here, is this div called ocean. And this ocean thing has a background color of aqua. So we can see it peeking out here. And then inside of it, we have these floating elements, all of these little boats with the background with the boat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we have another div called ship, and that just has a bunch of text inside of it. So while these like little boats are pushing the text down, if I look at the ship, which is the div that contains the text, it's not being pushed down at all. It thinks that it's starting in the top left corner, even though there's these like boats in the way. So for block elements, they don't even recognize that the float is there. They do not take up vertical space in a div, so they float atop of the block elements. So this block element is on the page, and the boats are kind of like just floating on top of it, going as leftmost as they can because we're telling them to float left. Whereas this inline stuff inside of it, the actual text, float allows whatever, is wrapping around the float element. Same here. This lighter blue, so if I click on this guy, this light blue, that's a background color of the ship. So this block element with the text in it looks like it's taking up the whole space of the ocean div, which contains both of them pretty much. Whereas if I have a block elements, well, these are block inline. We see that they're pushing the whole div down. So we have the background ocean div. We have our boats that are taking up space this time because they're pushing the block ship div down. And the other thing, so let's look at the style for this one. These guys are different. They have inline block and they don't have float left or anything. So this is that new display, not new, but like kind of third display property that we were talking about. So inline block is going to display somewhat like inline. It's going to display somewhat like block. It's going to be inline in the sense that it's not going to take up 100% width, and it's going to allow you to, well, it won't necessarily take up 100% width. It's going to allow you to place multiple block inline elements on the same line. So I have, one block. I have one block inline element. I have another, and they're going to stack, moving left as they can. But they are like block in the sense that I can give them a width and a height, and they're going to take up space within the content of my div. So they take up space and they push the next block element downwards. So we see the difference here. These guys are taking up space in my layout in terms of, pushing down the inline element so that they wrap around it, but they don't actually push down this light blue guy. They let that guy take up as much space as he wants. Whereas here we have, similar thing, all these elements inline, but they are taking up that space and pushing down this new block thing with text inside of it down to there. This last boat on the bottom, kind of sitting left out, that's a floated boat. See, it says it has dot left. If I click on it, it has float left. So this floated boat won't even extend the content of this like ocean div. Whereas if I make it, if I go into my CSS, or no, actually into my HTML, and we go to the boat, this last one here, this is a floated boat. If I make it a block boat, so I give it the class block so that that style gets applied to it, now my containing div grows to encapsulate it. Because it's block now, it's going to affect the layout of my thing. It's going to take up that space. If I switch it back to any float, even if I float it right, it will show up there, but it's not growing my div. For this reason, unless you are really wanting this like text to wrap around your image, unless you're wanting that magazine or newspaper style layout, inline block is kind of what you're going to want to use when you want to stack stuff in a line and have it be responsive so that it takes up and then it kind of overflows to the line underneath. This is kind of nice responsive design in that as I change my width, they reorganize themselves. So my inline block elements still kind of have this floaty behavior where they're all trying to get to the top and left part of where they're given. This guy, when he's given space, he pops up here. Or I guess it would be this guy pops up here. So similar nice behavior, but they also behave more straightforwardly with the rest of the elements around them. These guys all push this thing down. That makes sense. Here, all of these guys not pushing this thing down, but allowing the inline stuff to wrap around them, a little less straightforward. But useful, again, if we're looking for that specific kind of newspaper or magazine style of layout. The other problem that we're going to look at when we are using floats is the need to clear floats. When we want our elements to start after an element that has been floated, we have to clear this float. So in our example here, if I have these all floated to the left, and I want them to float to the left because I like this kind of responsiveness, but I don't want the text to wrap around it. I say, okay, well, I want this to all appear on the next kind of like line. I have to use a specific thing to clear the float. So in order to clear float within HTML and CSS, I have to first create an actual HTML element in my layout. So here I've created a div that's after all of these boats. Actually, we don't need it here. Up here. So this is that first ocean div. If I create a class inside of a div, new div called clear, and then in my CSS, I style that clear guy. Do I have it? No. I style the clear class, and I give it the property clear with the value both, meaning I'm going to clear floats in the left and right direction. And I save both of these. I refresh my thing. I see that all of these floating guys now cause there to be a new line after they're done. So we don't get that text popping up to be next to it. If we look at this one, we could do something where we have left and right. We'll comment on that, and maybe we just want to clear the right float. Give that a refresh. And, well, let's see if we can get it to a size where it... if we do the opposite, we might be able to get something more interesting. So we're going to clear the left float. So we see for this one that's floated right, we still get the wrapping around, but for the left-hand ones, it's creating a new line. So that's kind of a CSS kind of trick or hack that kind of grew out of not wanting this stuff to wrap around our floating stuff all the time. People started evolving and saying, like, I like this, but I don't want my elements to be like accidentally taking up the same line when I don't want them to. So they started using this clear fix to do it. This method with inline block is a bit newer. So kind of the evolution we have here is, we added float because we wanted that layout. Then we wanted to adapt and use it a bit differently, so clears were used. And now we have this inline block that kind of does the same thing and is a little better. But if we want to use floats and we're getting stuff stacking when we don't want to, the fix is to use a clear. So the inline block we looked at, it behaves like inline, except for you can set a width and height. And it also behaves like block, but it doesn't add a new line break before or after the element. So you can stack them. Any questions on kind of float or block inline or inline block? Cool. In general, like use float, play around with it, get an understanding, but it's not the main tool that you're going to be using. It's something that you should kind of try to avoid. But if you're using it for these projects to get an understanding or to do some simple thing, that's fine. But try and lead heavier on things like inline block, and there's some newer tools that also will help you to do things that float did, but in a better, more modern, kind of succinct way. And that's what we're looking at next. So we're looking into the future, but kind of actually the present. Because box model, float, all of these things are kind of older style CSS. You'll still see them, but people are they're not in the favor of most CSS developers these days. The tools that people are using one is called Flexbox. So Flexbox is a built-in thing in CSS. It's not an external thing. It's usable right out of the box. It aims to correct some of the frustrating parts of the box model. It rewrites how we do the layout of the page, but is not yet universally adopted. And I say sort of here because it pretty much is universally adopted. the site that shows like the adoption rate of different tech. We see Flexbox for CSS. Its global adoption rate is like 94.44%, plus 3.87% somewhat supported. So its total like support is like 98%. If we look at the chart here, it's just not supported on some old Opera and Opera mobile browsers, as well as like older Internet Explorer. So maybe not such a big deal in what we're developing for. Maybe your app is targeting these older browser users. Don't use Flexbox then. But I would say I like to use Flexbox, and it's pretty safe for the most part. But we're not going to look at that today. I think this week, Friday, you're going to look at Flexbox more. So don't worry about it as you're coding Tweeter and as you're like using things like inline block and float and however you're laying stuff out. Don't be like, oh no, I'm not using Flexbox. I'm not using the most modern thing. You'll have plenty of chance to use it in the future, and yeah, we will directly be covering it. The other kind of new tool, and which is newer than Flexbox, is CSS Grid. So grids as a concept have been used for a while in CSS, and it's the idea of breaking down a page into like columns and rows. So here we have, there's a column, there's a column, there's a column, and we also have rows going top to bottom. And with any content that we're showing, even like this magazine model, content very naturally fits into columns and rows. We have these 2-column text things. With any normal website, we have like headers and bodies and footers. Those are rows, and there's natural ways that we can take up those rows. In this guy, we have some spacing with a margin on the left, all of our content in the middle, and some spacing on the right. Because this is such a common layout, grids are very natural to use, and people have made their own grids. Or if you use Bootstrap, Bootstrap has a grid that you can use that says, I want this piece of content to take up 1/3 of my page in the width direction. I want this other thing to take up 2/3. So now I have like a responsive 2 columns. People have made their own grids. Frameworks have used grids, but now CSS has support directly within CSS for grids. It's newer than Flexbox. It isn't as well adopted yet, but it's something you can learn on your own, and it's recommended that you do check it out at some point. Again, if we look at this support page, we see it's at like 92%. A lot more red boxes. Again, Opera really not up with the time with a lot of things. But this every time I've checked back on this percentage is like going up. So if you're designing something for the future, if you're designing something, CSS Grid will just be gaining more and more support, and will be kind of universally accepted across browsers just as time goes on. But yeah, more so than Flexbox, though, it is good to be aware of some of the areas where it's limited in its support. Cool. The last thing we mentioned at the start, that this week maybe you're going to be looking into documentation a bit more on your own. Maybe you're going to be exploring stuff a bit more. Some good resources for CSS are MDN, so Mozilla Development Network. If you search anything that you're looking up in CSS, so if we're going like CSS inline block, and you just add MDN, it'll come up. And they have really good documentation. They always have good examples. They explain. So this is just on the display property for CSS in general. If we scroll down, or if we control find inline block, might be another page for it. Let's see. Let's make our search a little more specific. Oh, there we go. No, this is the same one. Yeah, we won't look at it for now, but like Block, you know, they have really good documentation in general to look for with all things CSS. The other really good resource is CSS Tricks. Let's do the same thing, inline block, because we failed with the first one. So CSS Tricks has an article on display as block. Flexbox. There's something on inline, some information on inline block. These guys are really nice because if you see right here, we have a published date and we also have an updated date. So they updated it 2017, even though it was published 2011. And that's always kind of helpful to look for with CSS because CSS has such a long history in terms of web development. You know, it was there since the beginning. It's good to know that the information you're looking at is somewhat relevant. If I'm looking at something on display and it's from, you know, way back in 2011, maybe I'm missing out on some things. So knowing that it's been updated is really nice. And in general, they explain things pretty thoroughly, and they have like really extensive coverage of CSS topics. So a good place to check with anything that you're stuck with as well. That's everything I was going to cover today. You guys will be hopping into Twitter pretty quickly, working on some CSS. And this afternoon, we're going to cover a bit more on specificity. So we briefly looked over that, like, oh, if I put something inline, that style will be applied over something else. But if I look into my float CSS, and I have all these different selectors, there's also like more complex selectors, where if I'm going div ocean, or div comma ocean, or div less than ocean, or maybe I'm going div ocean and then something like this. What are the differences between all of these, and what is the importance or order in which they're applied to my actual document? That's what we'll be looking partly over this afternoon, as well as just some other like general CSS stuff. But thank you guys. Actually, before we finish, any questions on kind of that last bit of material that we looked over? Cool. Yeah, get at it. Make sure you're using Chrome developer tools. Experiment a lot. Poke and prod things. CSS can be a little frustrating when it's like not doing what you want. But that's kind of the nature of the beast. You'll get a little more comfortable with it as you get actual practice. Thanks, and I'll try and get the notes up pretty quick for you guys.